The date was August 7th, 1942. Lieutenant Rex Barber wiped the sweat from his brow as he climbed into the cockpit of his P-38 Lightning over the steaming jungles of Guadalcanal. His hands were still shaking, not from fear, but from rage and frustration. Just 20 minutes earlier, he'd watched his wingman, Tommy, spiral into the ocean in a ball of flame. Tommy had made the same mistake they'd all been making since the Pacific War began. He'd tried to dogfight a Zero. The Japanese Mitsubishi, a 6M0, was a ghost in the sky, a machine that seemed to defy the laws of physics. Weighing just over 6,000 pounds when fully loaded, it could turn inside any American fighter like a hummingbird dancing around a hawk. American pilots had been taught since flight school that dogfighting close-quarters aerial combat was the mark of a true ace. Get on your enemy's tail, outmaneuver them, and shoot them down. But in the Pacific, that textbook was written in blood. Rex remembered his first encounter with a Zero 3 months earlier. He'd been confident, almost cocky. His P-38 Lightning was an engineering marvel: twin engines, twin booms, a central nacelle housing the pilot, and all the guns pointed straight ahead. No synchronized firing through propeller blades. Just pure, concentrated firepower. 4 50-caliber machine guns and 1 20mm cannon. He'd spotted the Zero at 12,000 feet, dove to intercept, and prepared for what he thought would be a straightforward kill. What happened next nearly cost him his life. The Zero pilot, whoever he was, whipped his aircraft into a turn so tight that Rex's P-38 couldn't follow. Within seconds, the hunter had become the hunted. Cannon shells stitched across Rex's right boom, puncturing fuel tanks and hydraulic lines. Only a desperate dive into cloud cover had saved him that day. Back at base, the other pilots shared similar stories. Lieutenant Ken Sparks had emptied his guns at a Zero in a turning fight every single round missed. The Zero then casually positioned itself on Ken's tail and nearly shot him down before running out of ammunition. Captain Richard Bong, who would later become America's top ace, admitted in the debriefing tent that trying to turn with a Zero was like trying to outdance Fred Astaire while wearing concrete boots. The statistics were devastating. In the first 6 months of the Pacific War, American pilots were being shot down at an alarming rate. For every 3 Japanese planes destroyed, 2 American fighters were lost. The Zero had become a symbol of Japanese air superiority, a symbol written in the wreckage of American aircraft scattered across the Pacific. But something was about to change. It started with a discovery that would alter the entire course of the air war. On July 11th, 1942, a Japanese pilot named Tadayoshi Koga took off from a carrier to attack Dutch Harbor in Alaska. During the battle, ground fire damaged his Zero. Disoriented and losing fuel, Koga attempted an emergency landing on Akutan Island. The wheels of his Zero hit the soft tundra, and the aircraft flipped violently forward, snapping Koga's neck instantly. His plane, however, remained remarkably intact. When American forces discovered the nearly undamaged Zero weeks later, they couldn't believe their luck. The aircraft was carefully dismantled, shipped to Naval Air Station North Island in San Diego, and meticulously restored to flying condition. For the first time, American pilots could study their enemy from the inside. Lieutenant Commander Eddie Sanders was one of the test pilots assigned to fly the captured Zero. His first flight report sent shockwaves through military command. Yes, the Zero could turn inside anything America had. Yes, it could climb faster than a P-38 at low speeds. Yes, it was more maneuverable than seemed physically possible. But Eddie had also discovered something else, something that would save thousands of American lives. The Zero had critical weaknesses. Its extraordinary maneuverability came at a terrible price. To achieve its feather-light weight, Japanese engineers had sacrificed almost everything else. The Zero had no armor plating protecting the pilot. No self-sealing fuel tanks. A single incendiary round could turn the entire aircraft into a fireball. And most importantly, Eddie discovered that above 300 miles per hour, the Zero's controls became dangerously stiff. At high speeds, the aircraft that danced through the sky like a ballerina became a sluggish, wallowing pig. The ailerons, the control surfaces that allowed the plane to roll, became almost impossible to move at high velocity. The Zero's lightweight construction, which made it so agile at low speeds, meant its control surfaces couldn't handle the aerodynamic forces of high-speed flight. Eddie landed the Zero after his third test flight and walked straight to the intelligence office. His report was just 3 words long, but those 3 words would change everything. Don't dogfight them. Within weeks, a new tactical doctrine began spreading through Pacific fighter squadrons. It had a simple name that belied its devastating effectiveness: boom and zoom. Rex Barber sat in the briefing tent as Major Thomas explained the new tactics. The concept was revolutionary in its simplicity. Use the P-38's superior speed and high-altitude performance. Dive from above, make one high-speed pass, and climb away before the Zero could respond. Never, ever turn with them. Never slow down. Never try to dogfight. "Gentlemen," Major Thomas said, his voice cutting through the humid air, "the age of chivalrous dogfighting is over. We're not knights jousting in the sky. We're persistence hunters. We're going to use speed, altitude, and patience to erase these Zeros from the sky." Some of the older pilots grumbled. This wasn't the romantic vision of aerial combat they'd grown up with. But Rex thought of Tommy spiraling into the ocean, and he knew the Major was right. The question was, would it work? Rex was about to find out. Intelligence reported a formation of 12 Zeros escorting bombers toward Henderson Field. It was time to test the new doctrine. As Rex pushed the throttles forward and his P-38 roared down the runway, he repeated the new mantra to himself: "Speed is life. Altitude is life insurance. Don't dogfight them." Altitude. Don't dogfight them. The war was about to change. The Americans were about to stop dancing with the Zero and start erasing them from the sky. But first, they would have to overcome decades of training, instinct, and ego. And in the unforgiving skies over the Pacific, mistakes weren't just punished. They were fatal. Rex Barber climbed at 20,000 feet, his twin Allison engines humming with power. Below him, the Pacific Ocean stretched endlessly. A sheet of hammered silver under the tropical Sunday, his radio crackled to life. Tally-ho, 12 Zeros, Angels 15, escorting Betty bombers. 5 miles north, heading straight for Henderson. Rex's heart hammered in his chest. This was it. 12 Zeros, the same aircraft that had terrorized American pilots for months. But today would be different. Today, Rex had altitude, speed, and a plan. He looked down at the formation. The Zeros flew in their characteristic loose pattern, weaving gracefully through the sky like a school of deadly fish. They were 5,000 feet below him, perfect. "Remember the brief," his squadron leader called over the radio. "One pass. High speed, no turning. Hit them and climb away. Do not engage in a turning fight." Rex rolled his P-38 inverted and pulled the nose down. The world spun as he dove, the airspeed indicator climbing rapidly. 250, 300, 350. 400 miles per hour. The twin engines screamed. The entire airframe shook with power. The Zeros grew larger in his gun sight. They hadn't seen him yet. They were looking level, not above. It was the oldest mistake in aerial combat, but one the Japanese pilots had gotten away with for months because American fighters usually attacked from the same altitude, trying to dogfight. Not anymore. Rex picked his target as Zero on the edge of the formation. His finger tensed on the trigger. At 400 yards, he opened fire. The 450 caliber machine guns and 20mm cannon erupted simultaneously. The P-38 shuddered as over 300 rounds per minute poured from its nose. The tracers arced through the air and found their mark. The Zero seemed to disintegrate. With no armor plating and no self-sealing fuel tanks, the concentrated firepower was devastating. The aircraft exploded in a brilliant orange fireball that blossomed across the sky. But Rex had no time to celebrate. He was screaming past the formation at over 400 miles per hour. the other Zeros now fully aware of the attack. He pulled back on the yoke, using his tremendous speed to climb away. The G-forces pressed him into his seat as the P-38 rocketed upward, back to altitude. Behind him, the Zeros tried to respond. 3 of them pulled into steep climbs, attempting to chase him. But at 400 miles per hour, their controls had locked up exactly as Eddie Sanders had discovered. Their ailerons wouldn't respond. Their elevators were stiff. The pilots pulled with all their strength, but their aircraft couldn't match the P-38's climbing speed. Rex leveled off at 22,000 feet, his hands still shaking from adrenaline. 1-0. Destroyed. No damage to his aircraft. He'd been in firing range for less than 3 seconds. "Splash 1, he called over the radio. Around him, his squadron mates were executing the same tactic. Dive, fire, zoom away. The Zeros scattered like startled birds, but they couldn't catch the faster, heavier American fighters climbing away above them. What happened next shocked even Rex. The Zeros, so accustomed to American fighters engaging them in turning battles, didn't know how to respond. They circled below, waiting for the P-38 seconds to come down and fight properly. When the Americans simply repositioned at altitude and dove again, the Japanese pilots were caught completely off guard. The second pass was even more devastating. 2 more Zeros exploded under the concentrated firepower of diving P-38 seconds. The remaining Japanese fighters broke formation and fled, abandoning the bombers they were supposed to protect. The American fighters ignored them. Following their new doctrine, they turned their attention to the slow, lumbering Betty bombers. Without the Zeros' protection, the bombers were helpless targets. Within minutes, 5 of the 7 bombers were smoking wrecks tumbling into the ocean. The entire engagement lasted less than 6 minutes. The Americans had destroyed 8 Japanese aircraft without losing a single P-38. Back at Henderson Field, the pilots climbed out of their cockpits in stunned silence. For months, they'd been trading losses almost equally with the Japanese. But today, using the new tactics, they'd achieved something that seemed impossible just weeks earlier: a completely one-sided victory. Major Thomas stood on the wing of Rex's aircraft, examining the guns. "You fired how many rounds?" "Maybe 200, sir." 3-second burst. The major shook his head in disbelief. "In the old way, you would have fired everything you had in a 5-minute turning fight, and probably still missed. This changes everything." Word of the victory spread through the Pacific Theater like wildfire. But it wasn't just about the tactics, it was about the psychology. For the first time since Pearl Harbor, American pilots felt like they had the upper hand. Captain Thomas McGuire, another pilot who would become one of America's top aces, put it best in his diary that night. "We've been trying to beat the Zero at its own game. Today we realized we don't have to play their game. We can make them play ours." But the Japanese weren't going to accept this quietly. 3 days later, intelligence reported something that made every American pilot's blood run cold. The Japanese had apparently figured out what was happening. They were changing their tactics too. Zero pilots were now flying in pairs, with one aircraft staying high specifically to counter the American diving attacks. Even worse, reports came in of a new Japanese fighter being deployed, the Kawasaki Ki-61, called Tony by the Americans. This aircraft had armor plating, self-sealing fuel tanks, and better high-speed handling. The Japanese were adapting. The arms race had begun, but the Americans had one more advantage that would prove decisive: better training, better communication, and better tactical flexibility. Major Gregory "Pappy" Boynton, the legendary Marine ace, refined the boom and zoom tactics even further. He developed what he called the thatch weave, a defensive maneuver where 2 aircraft would weave back and forth, covering each other's tails. If a Zero got behind one P-38, the pilot would turn toward his wingman. The wingman would then be in perfect position to shoot the Zero off his partner's tail. But it was a risky maneuver that required absolute trust between pilots and split-second timing. One mistake, one moment of hesitation, and both aircraft could be destroyed. Rex Barber was about to find out just how risky when, on his next mission, his wingman was a green replacement pilot, fresh from the States. The kid's name was Danny Morrison, and he'd arrived just 2 days earlier. He was 20 years old, had 200 hours of flight time, and had never seen combat. As they took off for a patrol mission over Bougainville, Rex looked over at Danny's P-38 and saw the kid give him a thumbs up. Danny's hand was shaking so badly that Rex could see it even from 50 feet away. "Stay on my wing," Rex called over the radio. "Do exactly what I do. Don't be a hero." "Yes, sir." Danny's voice cracked with nervousness. 20 minutes later, they encountered 6 Zeros at 18,000 feet. Rex immediately climbed, preparing for a diving attack. But then his radio exploded with Danny's panicked voice. "They're turning toward us. They're climbing. What do I do?" Rex's blood ran cold. The Zeros had spotted them early and were responding with their new tactics. One section continuing level, while 2 aircraft zoomed upward to cut off the American diving attack. For the first time since adopting the new doctrine, Rex Barber was going to have to improvise. And with a terrified rookie on his wing, one wrong move would kill them both. The Zeros were 2,000 feet below and closing fast. Rex had perhaps 10 seconds to make a decision that would determine whether he and Danny lived or died. The sky had suddenly become very, very small. Rex's mind raced through his options in microseconds. The textbook answer was to dive away, use speed to escape. But Danny was inexperienced. If Rex dove, would Danny follow? Or would the rookie panic and try to turn with the Zeros? "Danny, listen to me very carefully." Rex kept his voice calm despite his hammering heart. "When I say brake, push your nose down hard. Full throttle. Do not turn. Just dive. Understand?" I understand." Danny's voice was barely a whisper. The Zeros were 1,000 feet below now, their noses pointed upward, climbing to intercept. Rex could see the lead pilot, clearly probably a veteran, executing the new counter tactic perfectly. "Brake! Brake now!" Rex shoved his control yoke forward and firewalled the throttles. The P-38 pitched into a violent dive. He glanced left. Danny was following, his aircraft tucked in tight. Good. The kid had discipline. The Zeros tried to follow, pulling their noses up to track the diving Americans. But this was exactly what Rex had counted on. At their current speed and angle, the Zeros couldn't follow the dive without exceeding their airframe limits. Their lightweight construction, the same feature that made them so maneuverable, meant they couldn't handle the structural stress of a high-speed dive. One Zero pilot tried anyway. Rex watched as the aircraft attempted to follow them down. At 450 miles per hour, pieces began tearing off the Zero's wings. The fabric covering ripped away. Then, horrifyingly, the entire wing folded upward and separated from the fuselage. The Zero tumbled out of control, spinning end over end until it exploded against the ocean below. Rex pulled out of the dive at 5,000 feet, Danny still on his wing. They were safe. The remaining Zeros circled above, but didn't pursue. They'd learned a brutal lesson. Trying to counter American dive attacks with their fragile aircraft was suicide. Back at base, Danny climbed out of his cockpit and vomited on the tarmac. His hands were still shaking an hour later during debriefing, but he'd survived. He'd followed orders, kept his discipline, and lived to fly another day. "You did good, kid," Rex told him. "You'll make ace before this war is over." Danny looked at him with haunted eyes. "Is it always like that?" Rex thought of Tommy, spiraling into the ocean. He thought of the dozen other pilots he'd known who hadn't made it. "No," he said quietly. "Sometimes it's worse." Over the following months, the evolution of aerial combat in the Pacific accelerated at a breathtaking pace. The Americans refined their tactics further. Squadron leaders like Tommy McGuire and Richard Bong became masters of the boom and zoom, racking up kill after kill. But it wasn't just about individual skill anymore. It was about system, discipline, and teamwork. The Americans developed sophisticated patrol patterns. Flights would stack themselves at different altitudes, some at 25,000 feet, others at 20,000, and a lower group at 15,000. When enemy aircraft were spotted, the highest group would dive first, If they missed, or if more enemies appeared, the second group would attack. The lowest group protected against any Japanese fighters trying to climb up from below. It was aerial combat as chess match calculated, methodical, devastating. The Japanese, meanwhile, were trapped in a deadly paradox. The Zero was still an excellent aircraft for dogfighting, but the Americans simply refused to dogfight. Japanese pilots, trained for years in close-quarters maneuvering combat, found their skills becoming irrelevant. Captain Saburo Sakai, one of Japan's greatest aces, with over 60 kills, later wrote in his memoirs about the frustration. The American pilots had no honor. They would not fight us properly. They would dive from above, shoot, and run away like cowards. But they were not cowards. They were smart, and we were dying because of our pride. It was a stunning admission. The Japanese warrior code Bushido emphasized honor, courage, and direct confrontation. But in the skies over the Pacific, honor was getting pilots killed. The Americans had discovered something the Japanese military structure couldn't easily accept. In modern warfare, victory mattered more than valor. By early 1943, the kill ratios had dramatically reversed. For every American fighter lost, 4 or 5 Japanese aircraft were destroyed. The skies that had once belonged to the Zero were now dominated by American Lightnings, Corsairs, and Hellcats, all using the same basic doctrine: speed and altitude over maneuverability. But perhaps the most dramatic demonstration of the new tactics came on April 18, 1943, in an operation so daring that it seemed impossible. American intelligence had intercepted and decoded Japanese communications revealing that Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor, Japan's most brilliant military mind, would be flying to Bougainville to inspect Japanese forward bases. His flight path, timing, and aircraft were all known. The Americans decided to assassinate him from the air. 18 P-38 Lightnings, led by Major John Mitchell, took off from Henderson Field on a mission that would require flying 435 miles over open ocean at wave-top altitude to avoid radar detection, then climbing to intercept Yamamoto's transport aircraft at precisely the right time and place. One of those pilots was Rex Barber. The mission was called Operation Vengeance. The odds of success were estimated at less than 50%. If they were even a few minutes late, they'd miss Yamamoto. If they were spotted, they'd face overwhelming enemy forces. If they got lost over the trackless ocean, they'd run out of fuel and crash into the Pacific. Rex checked his watch as the formation skimmed just feet above the wavetops. The wind buffeted his aircraft. Salt spray coated his windscreen. They'd been flying for nearly 2 hours, navigating by dead reckoning and a magnetic compass. If Major Mitchell's calculations were off by even a few degrees, they'd miss the intercept point entirely. "Bogies, 11 o'clock high," someone shouted over the radio. Rex looked up. There they were, 2 Mitsubishi G-4M Betty bombers with 6 Zero escorts, exactly as intelligence had predicted. Yamamoto was in one of those bombers. The P-38 second split into 2 groups. 12 aircraft climbed to engage the Zero escorts. The remaining 6, including Rex, went after the bombers. The Zeros dove to intercept, but they were caught in the worst possible position below the attacking Americans with no altitude advantage. The P-38 seconds used their superior speed to blow through the Zero formation before the Japanese pilots could effectively respond. Rex locked onto one of the Betty bombers. The aircraft was already descending, trying to escape into the jungle canopy. He closed to 200 yards and opened fire. His rounds tore through the bomber's unarmored fuselage. Black smoke poured from one engine. The Betty's wing erupted in flames. The aircraft rolled onto its back and plunged into the jungle, exploding in a massive fireball. Unknown to Rex at that moment, the aircraft he'd just destroyed was carrying Admiral Yamamoto. The man who planned Pearl Harbor was dead, killed by the very tactics that had evolved from the lessons learned fighting his Zeros. The mission was a complete success. Both bombers were destroyed, 3 Zeros were shot down, and all but 1 P-38 returned safely. The death of Yamamoto was a devastating blow to Japanese morale and military leadership, But more importantly, Operation Vengeance proved something crucial. American pilots, using disciplined tactics that emphasized speed and positioning over dogfighting prowess, could accomplish missions that would have been suicidal just a year earlier. Rex Barber landed back at Henderson Field nearly 4 hours after takeoff, his fuel tanks almost empty, his hands cramped from gripping the controls. He didn't know yet that he'd killed Yamamoto that wouldn't be confirmed for several days. But he knew something had changed. The hunted had become the hunters. The Americans hadn't just learned to survive against the Zero, they'd learned to dominate. That night, sitting in the mess tent, Danny Morrison approached Rex. The rookie, who'd nearly panicked during his first combat, was now a different man. Harder, more confident. He'd flown 5 more missions and scored his first kill. "I heard about today's mission," Danny said. "The one you can't talk about." Rex just nodded, sipping his coffee. "Whatever it was," Danny continued, "I want you to know something. When I first got here, I was terrified. I thought the Zero was unbeatable. But you showed me it wasn't about the plane. It was about the pilot and the tactics. You saved my life up there, and you taught me how to fight." Rex looked at the young pilot. "You saved your own life, Danny. You kept your discipline when it mattered. That's the only thing that counts up there." Danny smiled. "Still, thank you." As the rookie walked away, Rex thought about how far they'd all come. From the dark days of 1942, when every encounter with a Zero felt like a death sentence, to now when American pilots own the skies. But the war was far from over. The Japanese were developing new aircraft, new tactics, new weapons. And there was something else. Something that intelligence reports were only beginning to hint at. The Japanese were becoming desperate. And desperate enemies did desperate things. October 1944. 2 years after that first successful boom and zoom attack, Rex Barber stood on the deck of the USS Essex, watching the Philippine Islands emerge from the morning haze. He was now a major, with 17 confirmed kills and a chest full of medals. Danny Morrison stood beside him, a captain now, with 12 kills of his own. The war had changed both of them. Rex's hands no longer shook before combat. Danny no longer vomited after missions. They'd become what the war had demanded. Efficient, disciplined killers of aircraft and men. But something else had changed too. The Japanese were no longer just fighting to win. They were fighting to die. Intelligence reports had been filtering in for weeks about a new tactic. A Japanese word that sent chills down every American pilot's spine. Kamikaze. Divine wind. Pilots who deliberately crashed their aircraft into American ships, turning themselves into guided missiles. "They're not even trying to survive anymore," Danny said quietly, staring at the distant islands. "What do you do against an enemy who wants to die?" Rex didn't have an answer. The Battle of Leyte Gulf was about to begin, the largest naval battle in history. Over 200,000 sailors, hundreds of ships, and thousands of aircraft would clash in a struggle that would determine the fate of the Philippines and possibly the entire Pacific War. The first kamikaze attack came on October 21st. Rex was on patrol at 15,000 feet when he saw them, a formation of 20 Zeros, but flying in a way he'd never seen before. No weaving, no tactical formation, just straight lines, heading directly for the American carriers below. "Bandits inbound! Kamikaze attack!" the radio screamed. Rex and his squadron dove to intercept, using the same boom and zoom tactics they'd perfected over 2 years. He lined up on a Zero, fired a 3-second burst, and watched it explode. But the pilot didn't try to evade, didn't try to maneuver, just kept flying straight until Rex's bullets found him. It was like shooting at targets on a range. Except these targets had once been men with families, with dreams, with futures. Danny got 2 more. The squadron destroyed 14 of the 20 attacking aircraft, but 6 got through. Rex watched in horror as 1 Zero, trailing smoke and fire, crashed directly into the carrier USS Princeton. The explosion was massive, far larger than it should have been. The kamikaze had struck the ship's ammunition stores. Secondary explosions ripped through the Princeton for hours. By evening, the carrier had to be abandoned and sunk by American torpedoes to prevent her from falling into enemy hands. Over 200 sailors died on the Princeton, all because of tactics that American pilots couldn't fully counter. You could shoot down a kamikaze, but if you missed, or if you got him too late, his momentum would carry the flaming wreckage directly into its target. The psychological impact was devastating. American pilots had learned to dominate the Zero in aerial combat. But kamikaze attacks weren't combat. They were suicide missions, where the traditional rules of engagement meant nothing. "We're hunting ghosts," Danny said that night. "How do you intimidate a man who's already dead?" But the Americans adapted again. They always adapted. New tactics emerged within days. Instead of waiting to intercept kamikazes near the fleet, American fighters began patrolling much farther out, creating multiple defensive layers. The goal wasn't just to shoot down the enemy, it was to shoot them down as far from the ships as possible. P-38 pilots began carrying more ammunition and less fuel, knowing they'd be in extended engagements with waves of suicide attackers. The boom and zoom tactics evolved again. Now pilots would make multiple high-speed passes on the same target if necessary, because even if a kamikaze was damaged and on fire, he'd still try to reach his target. Rex found himself flying 4, sometimes 5 missions a day. The exhaustion was crushing. But every kamikaze they stopped was a ship that survived, hundreds of sailors who lived to see another day. On October 25th, during the height of the Battle of Leyte Gulf, Rex encountered something that would stay with him for the rest of his life. He was at 20,000 feet, desperately low on ammunition, when he spotted a lone Zero limping toward the American fleet. One engine was smoking. The aircraft was damaged, but it kept coming, unwavering in its purpose. Rex dove, lined up his shot, and squeezed the trigger. Nothing. He was out of ammunition. He pulled alongside the Zero, just 50 feet away. For the first time, he could clearly see the Japanese pilot, a young man, probably no older than Danny had been when he first arrived. The pilot looked over at Rex. For a moment, their eyes met. Rex expected to see hatred. Instead, he saw something that shook him to his core. Resignation. This wasn't a warrior eager for glorious death. This was a scared young man who'd been told his life meant less than his death. Rex made a decision. He couldn't shoot the Zero down, but he could stop him. He banked his P-38 directly in front of the Zero's nose and slowed down, forcing the Japanese pilot to either climb above him or risk collision. The Zero pilot tried to go around. Rex blocked him again. For nearly 5 minutes, Rex used his aircraft as a shield, herding the damaged Zero away from the fleet. Finally, either out of fuel or acceptance, the Japanese pilot turned away and headed for the open ocean. Rex watched as the Zero's engine finally quit. The aircraft glided down and ditched in the water. Rex circled once, saw the pilot climb out onto the wing, and then headed back to the carrier. He never reported the incident. He'd violated standing orders. Kamikaze pilots were to be destroyed, not diverted. But Rex couldn't shake the look in that young pilot's eyes. The war had made Rex many things, but it hadn't made him a murderer of desperate, defeated men. The Battle of Leyte Gulf ended with a decisive American victory. Japan's naval power was broken. Their carriers were sunk or damaged beyond repair. Their experienced pilots, the ones who had once made the Zero such a terrifying opponent, were mostly dead. By early 1945, the nature of the Pacific Air War had completely transformed. American pilots weren't just dominating, they were achieving kill ratios that seemed impossible. 10-1, 15-1. In some engagements, 20-1. The Zero, once the most feared fighter in the world, had become obsolete not because it was a bad aircraft, but because the entire doctrine of aerial combat had evolved beyond it. The age of the dogfight, that romantic notion of knights jousting in the sky, was over. It had been replaced by something more efficient, more brutal, and more effective. Speed, altitude, discipline, teamwork. These were the new pillars of aerial combat. In February 1945, Rex Barber flew his last combat mission. He'd survived hundreds of flights, 23 confirmed kills, and countless near-death experiences. Danny Morrison was right beside him, a major himself now, with 19 kills. As they headed back to base after an uneventful patrol, Danny radioed over. "Hey, Rex, remember that first mission? When I nearly got us both killed? You didn't nearly get us killed. You kept your head and followed orders. Only because you kept yours. You taught me the most important lesson of this war." "What's that?" "That survival isn't about being the best dogfighter or having the most maneuverable plane. It's about being smarter than the enemy. It's about making them fight your fight, not theirs." Rex thought about all the pilots who hadn't learned that lesson. Tommy, spiraling into the ocean in those early days. Hundreds of others who'd tried to turn with zeros and paid the ultimate price. And just as tragically, thousands of young Japanese pilots who'd been sent up in obsolete aircraft with obsolete tactics, ordered to die for an empire that was already defeated. The war ended in August 1945 with the dropping of atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The kamikazes never came. Japan surrendered unconditionally. Years later, in 1991, Rex Barber attended a reunion of Pacific War veterans. Among the attendees was an elderly Japanese man named Kaname Harada, a former Zero pilot who'd survived the war. Through a translator, they talked for hours. Harada described the frustration of watching American fighters dive away every time he tried to engage them. "We called you cowards," he said with a sad smile, "but you were just smarter than us. You understood that the purpose of war isn't to fight honorably, it's to win." "What about the kamikazes?" Rex asked. "Did you ever?" Harada shook his head. "I was assigned to several kamikaze units, but each time the war moved faster than the missions could be launched. I survived by accident, not by choice." Rex thought about the young pilot he'd herded away from the fleet in 1944. "I let one of you go once," he said quietly. "A kamikaze. I couldn't shoot him, so I just pushed him away from the ships." Harada's eyes widened. Then, incredibly, they filled with tears. "October 25th, 1944, Battle of Leyte Gulf?" Rex felt his heart stop. "How did you?" "That was me," Harada said, his voice breaking. "I was that pilot. My engine was damaged. I was out of options. And then this crazy American pilot started blocking my path. I thought you were mocking me, playing with me before killing me. When you didn't shoot, I didn't understand. I thought maybe your guns were jammed. So I turned away, ditched in the ocean, and was rescued by a Japanese submarine the next day." For a long moment, neither man could speak. The translator stood quietly, tears running down her face. "I never told anyone," Rex finally said. "I broke orders." "You saved my life," Harada replied. "I went home after the war, became a teacher, had 3 children and 7 grandchildren, all because you chose mercy when you could have chosen duty. The 2 old warriors' enemies once, now just old men who'd survived an insane war, embraced. Around them, other veterans, American and Japanese alike, watched in silence. The legacy of the Pacific Air War wasn't just about tactics and technology. It wasn't just about how American pilots learned to stop dogfighting and started using speed and altitude to erase zeros from the sky. It was about how warfare itself had evolved. The romantic notions of chivalrous combat had given way to industrial efficiency. Honor had been replaced by effectiveness. The individual ace had been superseded by the coordinated squadron. But underneath all that evolution, underneath all the tactics and strategy, there remained something irreducibly human. The choice to show mercy. The decision that even in war, some things mattered more than victory. Rex Barber died in 2001 at the age of 84. Kaname Hirata spoke at his funeral, telling the story of October 25th, 1944, to a room full of people who'd never heard it before. People remember the Pacific Air War for many things, Hirata said. For the Zeros, for the P-38 seconds, for the tactics that changed aerial combat forever. But I remember it for one thing, the day an American pilot had every right to kill me, and chose not to. That choice, that mercy taught me more about honor than any warrior code ever could. The audience sat in stunned silence. Rex Barber and pilots like him didn't just learn how to defeat the Zero, Hirata continued. They learned something harder. How to remain human while fighting an inhuman war. That's why they won. Not just because their tactics were better, but because they never forgot who they were. The P-38 Lightning, the aircraft that had carried out this revolution in aerial warfare, is now retired. You can see them in museums, gleaming monuments to American engineering and tactical innovation. But the lessons learned in those desperate skies over the Pacific remain relevant today. In war, adaptability defeats tradition. Discipline defeats recklessness. Intelligence defeats bravery. And sometimes, just sometimes, mercy defeats hatred. The Zero was a magnificent aircraft flown by brave men. But bravery wasn't enough. The Americans had discovered something the Japanese military structure couldn't adapt to quickly enough. In modern warfare, it's not about fighting well. It's about fighting smart. That's why P-38 pilots stopped dogfighting. That's how they started erasing Zeros from the sky. And that's why, 70 years later, we still study their tactics in military academies around the world. The age of the dogfight ended in the Pacific. The age of precision warfare had begun. And it all started with one simple realization. You don't have to fight the enemy's fight. You make them fight yours.